I woke up early that morning before the sun had even begun to warm the windows. The house was still quiet, save for the slow tick of the wall clock that had followed me through decades. I always liked waking before everyone else, when I still believed the silence meant possibility, not loneliness. It was my birthday, not a milestone one, nothing ending in a 0 or 5, just another year, stacked quietly on top of the others. I didn't expect balloons or singing. I just wanted warmth, a hug, maybe a card with a handwritten message, something that would say, "We see you." So I set the table. 3 cups, 1 chipped. I made tea. I folded the napkins like I used to when they were little and wanted everything to feel fancy. I even lit a candle for atmosphere, though I had to fish it from the back of the junk drawer. My hands shook a little from the cold, or the years, I'm not sure which, but I managed. I made pancakes, the kind she used to love, the ones with too much butter, and just a splash of vanilla. As I flipped them, I allowed myself a little smile. Maybe this year they'd remember something. Maybe this time it would be different. The floorboards creaked behind me, someone finally up. I turned ready to offer a good morning, but the door didn't open. Footsteps stopped in the hallway, then turned back. No one came to the kitchen. No happy birthday, Mom. No smell of coffee not made by my own hand. I sat at the table alone, watched the candle flicker then burn down without a breeze to carry it. I cut the pancake on my plate, chewed slowly and tried to swallow around the knot in my throat. Maybe they were just tired. Maybe they were planning something later. That's what I told myself. That's what I always told myself, this endless permission I gave to people I loved to hurt me gently. I washed the plates. Mine. Only mine. And still I folded their napkins and placed them back in the drawer, as if I was preparing for a kindness that hadn't yet arrived. Later that afternoon, I walked down the hall to check the laundry, and that's when I heard it. 2 voices not even trying to whisper. The door to her room was slightly ajar, and maybe they thought I had gone out. Maybe they didn't care. I paused instinctively, quiet. The words weren't shouted, but they landed like stones. God, how many more birthdays is she going to have? I swear I hope this one's the last. I can't take another year of this. The silence that followed was worse than the words themselves. No one corrected her. No one laughed it off or called it out. Just a sigh and the sound of fingers tapping a phone screen. I stood there frozen, hands still clutching the edge of the laundry basket. For a moment I wasn't a mother, or a person even. I was a ghost haunting my own hallway, hearing my obituary whispered before I'd even had my cake. I turned quietly, tiptoeing back the way I came. I didn't want them to see me cry, not because I was proud, but because if I started crying, I wasn't sure I'd stop. I sat back down in the kitchen staring at the sink. There was still a plate drying on the rack, still crumbs from the breakfast I had hoped would bring us together. And I thought of all the birthdays I'd planned for her balloons. I stayed up blowing till my jaw ached, cakes baked with pennies scraped together, gifts wrapped in magazine pages when we couldn't afford wrapping paper. I remembered her tiny hands tugging at my apron, squealing when I brought out her favorite doll. She used to look at me like I was the sun itself. When did I become her burden? When did I turn from comfort into inconvenience? There's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't scream. It just settles into your bones like a damp chill, making everything heavier. That was the kind I carried for the rest of the day. I didn't mention what I heard. I didn't confront anyone. I just smiled quietly and made sure the house stayed warm, the lights soft, the food ready. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We take the blade and turn it inward, tell ourselves they didn't mean it. They're just stressed. They didn't know we were listening. But I had heard every word, and something small inside me shifted, not an explosion, just a crack hairline and silent. But once a crack forms even in the thickest stone, it never really goes away. It waits. They brought out the cake in the evening after dinner, almost as an afterthought. A small one from the grocery store plastic dome, still slightly fogged from the fridge. The icing was the same garish pink they used for all the cheap ones, and the writing read, "Happy Day," as if even the sentiment was too much effort to spell out fully. Still, I smiled. I clapped politely. I thanked them in the softest voice I could manage, hoping they wouldn't hear the tremble underneath. The candles weren't lit. There were no matches in the drawer, and no one offered to find a lighter. So I leaned forward anyway, made a wish to no one in particular, and blew on invisible flames. They laughed, not kindly. Someone took a photo, but no one showed it to me. We cut the cake dry and overly sweet, and ate in silence. The television was on in the background, some sitcom where mothers were always warm, funny accepted. I let the laugh track wash over me. They scrolled through their phones' forks, tapping the plates, not really tasting anything. One of them mentioned going out afterward, not a word about staying in with me. I watched my own celebration shrink down to crumbs. I cleared the plates while they got their coats. No one stopped me. No one said, "You shouldn't have to clean on your birthday." I heard the front door close, the quick patter of boots on concrete, and then just silence again. I sat down on the couch, the small couch that used to be crowded with little feet and loud stories. I held a paper napkin in my lap and looked at the stain of icing that had bled through. I used to spend whole evenings making birthday banners by hand. I used to frost cakes while humming lullabies, feeling like I was creating magic out of flour and sugar. But now even the candles had been forgotten. It's strange how a room can feel so full of memory and yet so empty in the present. Every corner of that living room held echoes, giggles, first steps, sleepy hugs. But that night all I heard was the buzz of the refrigerator and the slow hum of my own breath. I sat there for a long time, longer than I needed to, not waiting for them to come back, but for the ache to settle into something manageable. I wrapped the leftover cake in foil and placed it in the fridge. I knew they wouldn't want it, but I couldn't throw it away. Not yet. There's a kind of sorrow that doesn't cry or scream. It just lingers like perfume on an old sweater. And as I washed my hands at the sink, I saw the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. Older, yes, but also smaller, quieter, like someone who'd been erased over time, one forgotten birthday at a time. I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, as if every movement could remind me that I still existed, that I still had weight substance worth, even if they didn't see it. The next day she handed me a small box. "Oh, right. Your gift," she said, as if she were remembering something from the bottom of a grocery list. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She was already distracted by her phone, one hand tapping out messages, while the other held out the box like a transaction. I took it with both hands gently, because my hands have always been gentle, even when my heart wasn't being held the same way. The ribbon had been reused. I could tell by the slight tear along its edge, the way it curled awkwardly as if it didn't belong there anymore. I undid it quietly, slowly, not because I was savoring the moment, but because I feared what I might find inside. The weight was familiar, too familiar. When I opened the lid, I stared down at the necklace, a silver locket with a tiny dent on the side, the one I'd given her years ago, tucked carefully in velvet on the night she got into her college of choice, back when I still worked nights, sewing buttons at the factory just to afford something nice. I remembered her teary smile when she first opened it. I remembered how she hugged me, buried her face in my sweater, and whispered, "I'll never take it off." Taking. But she had, and now she was giving it back to me, rewrapped, as if I wouldn't notice. as if I wouldn't feel the sting of being handed my own love discarded and disguised as generosity. She said something about how vintage is in now and how I might like it again. I smiled. Of course I did. I always smiled. I nodded and thanked her gently, tracing the locket's edge with my thumb, while every memory it held curled inward like an autumn leaf, left too long in the wind. She left the room as quickly as she'd entered it. No hug, no warmth, just a box emptied of meaning, a gesture that felt more like a task completed than a gift offered. I held the locket in my hand for a long time after she left. It felt heavier now, not from metal, but from what it represented. The circle had closed. What was once a promise had become an afterthought. And it wasn't about the locket. Not really. It was about the erosion, how small dismissals add up, how warmth cools slowly, until one day you wake up and realize you're shivering. It was about all the moments I gave and how few were ever returned. The birthdays, the rides to school, the nights spent by her bedside, when she had fevers. All those moments distilled into a re-gifted necklace she didn't want anymore. I set the locket on the windowsill where the sun could touch it. Maybe it needed light again. Or maybe I did. I couldn't tell anymore. And still, I didn't say anything. I didn't throw it back or raise my voice. I just let the silence wrap itself around me. I was growing used to it. Sometimes silence is easier than admitting you're invisible to the people you once would have bled for. That night, long after the lights had dimmed and the house had fallen into its usual hush, I lay awake in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, like it might give me answers. The moonlight crept in through the thin curtains, soft and indifferent, casting long shadows on the floor. I could still hear her voice from earlier, sharp, impatient, tossed out like old wrapping paper. She's just lingering. I mean, how long is she going to be around? Not whispered this time, not hidden, just spoken plainly like someone discussing the weather. It didn't come from cruelty, at least not the theatrical kind. It came from something colder, indifference, that I think hurts more than hatred. When someone you loved stops seeing you as someone worth resenting and instead begins seeing you as a chore. I turned to my side, pulled the blanket up to my chin, the same one I knitted during that long winter years ago when she had the flu and I slept on the floor next to her bed. I still remember how she clung to me, how she'd only fall asleep if my hand was near hers. And now, she doesn't even see me. Not really. That phrase just lingering circled in my mind like a moth around a bulb. Lingering, like a bad smell, like a stain, like something overstaying its welcome. I thought of all the times I lingered in her doorway when she was little, just to watch her sleep and know she was safe. I thought of the years I lingered at her school plays cheering until my voice gave out, and now my presence is an inconvenience, a guest that refuses to leave. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that it was just frustration that young people say things, but deep down I knew better. Because truth doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it slips in through cracks on the back of a sigh or a flippant comment. And once you see it, once you hear it, you can't unhear it. My body felt heavy in that bed, not from age, but from carrying too many disappointments, the kind you can't share, because saying them aloud makes them real. So instead, I turned toward the wall where a photograph hung crookedly. A family portrait from years ago. I was younger, smiling too wide. She was leaning on me, head on my shoulder, eyes sparkling. I wondered when the shift happened. When did I become someone who had to tiptoe around her moods? When did my love start to feel like a debt she resented having to repay? Some nights the hardest part is not the loneliness. It's remembering a time when you weren't. That ache for a version of your child who no longer exists, or maybe was never truly there. I don't know which is sadder. The clock ticked toward midnight. My birthday had passed. Not a single moment had felt like celebration. No embrace, no handwritten note. Only a gift returned to sender, and a sentence that cut deeper than any silence ever had. And yet I lay there quietly. Because that's what we're taught, isn't it? To be graceful, to age without complaint, to disappear politely. But something in me stirred that night. Not loud, just a whisper. A reminder that I was still here. That I had a heart not meant to be shelved. And that maybe, just maybe, lingering didn't mean what she thought it did. Maybe it meant surviving. The following morning I made tea the old way, loose leaves in the pot boiled water, poured slowly in spirals, steeped for the full 7 minutes. There was something about the ritual that grounded me. Maybe because I used to do it every Sunday back when we still had slow mornings and they wanted to sit at the table with me. Back when she would peek into the kitchen and ask, "Is the tea ready yet?" Mama, like it was a treat, meant just for her. I sat alone with my cup, holding it close to feel the warmth, letting the steam soften the ache that had settled in my chest. I thought of all the birthdays over the years, not just mine, but hers too. I had a little notebook where I used to track every little detail, which cake she liked at 7, the dress she wore at 12, the theme party I threw when she turned 16. Even though we couldn't afford decorations, I hand-painted stars to hang from the ceiling. And I remembered how I used to count coins, literally. There was a jar I kept hidden in the cupboard behind the rice bags labeled "Rainy Day," but it was never for me. It was always for her. A field trip she forgot to mention. A new pair of shoes after she outgrew the last too fast. Once she cried over not having the right kind of jeans, and I sold my old sewing machine just so she wouldn't feel out of place at school. All those years I kept a tally, not because I wanted repayment, but because each sacrifice meant something. A ledger of love written in small acts no one ever saw. But lately, the tally had started to feel one-sided. Not because I wanted anything extravagant in return, just a little recognition. A thank you that wasn't hollow. A hug that didn't feel like obligation. A daughter who remembered that I was a person, not just a provider, not just a fixture. I stared down at my hands wrapped around the cup, the veins more visible now, the skin thinner, but they were the same hands that had held her through fevers, stitched, torn backpacks and wiped away her tears. These hands had built her world, and now they were treated like relics, something old in the way to be brushed aside. There's something painful about realizing your love has become invisible, that the years you gave away so freely are now seen as expected background noise. I don't mind growing old. I mind being unseen. I mind feeling like a shadow cast by someone else's spotlight. That morning I walked to the cupboard and found the jar still there, dusty and forgotten. I held it in my lap at the table. The coins inside didn't matter anymore. They were mostly symbolic now, tucked behind newer things and long ignored. But I held it like I had, back when it still felt like hope. And I realized something quietly devastating no one had added to the jar, but me. Not once, not ever. It had been mine, alone, always. I put it back gently, but not as far behind as before. I wanted it visible now, even if just for me. A small reminder that I had once loved with everything I had, that I still could. But maybe it was time to stop giving to a well that had long since run dry. That afternoon I returned to the cupboard not to check the jar again, but to take it down entirely. I set it on the kitchen table and opened it for the first time in years. The coins inside didn't clink like they used to. A few bills folded and faded nestled at the bottom like forgotten memories. I sifted through them slowly, each piece a chapter, each dollar a story. A pair of ballet shoes, a sudden hospital bill, a school trip to the mountains, a wedding deposit. It wasn't a fortune, but it had been everything I had when I gave it. And nestled beneath the bills under a receipt from her first apartment's security deposit was a folded envelope. I had written her name on it in my careful cursive back when I still thought the future would be beautiful for her because of me. That envelope held the start of the wedding fund. I'd begun it before she even got engaged, long before she'd ever asked. Because that's what mothers do. We prepare for joy even when it hasn't arrived yet. I opened the envelope not to cry but to remember. Inside was the first check I had written never cashed. I remember she laughed when I gave it to her, said she didn't want to deal with paper stuff and that we'd handle it all later. But later never came. She started spending without asking, assuming the fund would always be there. There were catering invoices, a deposit on a dress, a DJ she didn't even consult me about. I paid for all of it quietly, like always. And not once did she stop to ask if I could afford it. Not once did she say thank you. I touched the edge of the check, my name, in shaky ink. The amount smaller than I remembered, but it might as well have been gold at the time. I had earned it stitch by stitch, sacrifice by sacrifice. Every cent was a piece of me. I hadn't thought about the fund in a while. Not since the engagement fell apart and then rekindled and then everything got messy again. I was told to stay out of it. It's her life now, they said. But when things got tight, the fund was still used bit by bit, like the jar would never empty. But it had emptied, in more ways than one. That afternoon, I moved the jar to my room. Not hidden, not ashamed, just somewhere I could see it hold it. I needed to reclaim something, not the money, the meaning. I wrapped the check in a cloth napkin and placed it in my drawer beside my old keepsakes, a lock of her baby hair, a school award she once gave me to keep forever, a photo of the two of us on her graduation day when she still leaned into me for warmth. I didn't make a decision then, not a big one, but I felt something stir inside me, like a rope being pulled gently from the well. I had spent decades drawing water for her. Maybe it was time to drink some of it for myself. The sun was setting outside the window. The light turned the walls golden the way they used to glow when she was little, and we'd dance in the kitchen after dinner. I touched the edge of the windowsill, then the edge of my heart. I was still here, still whole, even if slightly bruised. And I thought not with anger, but with clarity maybe not everything I gave away was meant to stay gone. Dinner the next evening was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels curated like a scene set for strangers pretending to be family. The table had been set, without my help. That was rare, not thoughtful, just faster perhaps. But when I walked in, there were only 3 plates, 3 chairs. I paused, blinking slowly, thinking maybe they were rearranging, or hadn't finished. But no, my place wasn't there. She looked up from her phone just long enough to say, "Oh, I thought you'd already eaten." Already eaten, in my own home, on a day when I had roasted the chicken, peeled the carrots, and set the timer for the rice. I hadn't, of course. I'd been upstairs folding laundry that wasn't mine, thinking of nothing in particular. But something in me went still. "No," I replied quietly. "I haven't eaten yet." Shrug. "There's still some left, I think." That was it. No apology. No gesture to grab another plate. Just that blank modern indifference. The kind that doesn't burn but freezes. The kind that makes you wonder if you've become furniture, something present functional and ignorable. I walked to the counter and made myself a plate. No one stopped talking. They didn't even pause. I sat at the far end on a stool not even within arm's reach of the table. I chewed slowly. The food had gone cold. Still I swallowed it. I've swallowed worse. As I sat there separate but present, I remembered every birthday meal I had made for her, all the times I stayed up basting turkey or kneading dough because she liked homemade better. I remembered one year when we couldn't afford dessert, so I learned to make cake from scratch using pantry staples. And Hope, she had loved it, said it was the best thing she'd ever eaten. Back then, I was magic. Now I was just someone who already ate. After they finished, they cleared their own plates, not mine. I stayed where I was, letting the silence swell. Eventually, I got up and cleaned my dishwash the rest while I was at it. Habit is funny that way. Our hands remember the shape of duty even when our hearts have gone numb. That night in bed, I stared up at the ceiling again. Same crack, same shadows, but my thoughts were different. I no longer felt sad. I felt absent, like something had shut off inside me. A light that had gone cold but hadn't flickered first. A quiet knowing that I was no longer expected, only endured. It's a strange feeling to be erased so slowly. You don't realize it's happening until the seat at the table is gone, until you look around and realize no one wonders what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you need. You just exist in the gaps between chores, between errands, between their real lives. And yet I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my voice or slam a dish. That's not how I was raised. That's not who I became. But I did tuck away a truth I could no longer unsee. I had become invisible to the very people I once nourished. I went to sleep with that truth nestled against my ribs, not sharp yet, just heavy. The next morning I waited until she had finished her phone calls and was putting on her makeup, always in a rush, always half listening to ask a simple question, one I already knew the answer to, but I needed to hear it from her lips. Is something wrong between us? She paused just a second too long, the way someone does when they've already formed an answer, but no, it won't sound nice. Wrong, she said, dabbing powder beneath her chin. No. Why would there be? I smiled small and sad. You've been distant, and I just thought maybe... She cut me off. You're reading too much into things, Mom. Don't start this again. Start what again? I hadn't started anything. I had only asked. And even that apparently was too much. She waved a hand like she was brushing lint off her sleeve. Look, I've got a lot going on right now. Can we not do this? I nodded. Of course. Always nodding. Always making things easier for other people. Even when my heart was a cupboard full of unspoken things, waiting to be dusted off and named. She left before I could say anything more. The door closed softly, but with finality. Not a slam, just a sound that meant the conversation had ended, even if it had never really begun. I stood there in the hallway feeling foolish. My shadow looked long and thin against the wall, stretched by morning light, but barely touching anything solid. It reminded me of how our conversations had become long but shallow, present but never really connecting. I went back to my room and sat at the edge of the bed. The locket she'd returned sat on the nightstand. I picked it up, opened it. Inside was the picture I'd put in when I first gave it to her, the two of us, on a picnic blanket when she was 7, our cheeks pressed together, both of us grinning, like the world couldn't touch us. That was a lifetime ago. I closed the locket and held it in my palm until the metal warmed to my skin. That was the closest I could get to closeness, now memories that still held temperature. And it hit me not as a blow, but as a slow seeping truth. She wasn't angry with me. She wasn't resentful or spiteful or cruel. She was indifferent. And in some ways, that's harder to carry. Because you can fix resentment, you can mend anger, but indifference, that's a wall with no door. I thought of all the ways I'd tried to stay close, the tea, the quiet gestures, the savings jar, and now even my simplest question was met with impatience, as if I were the one creating trouble just by caring. There's a moment in every woman's life, I think, when she stops trying to explain herself to people who've already decided they've outgrown her. I felt that moment bloom inside me, a soft, mournful blossom that said, "You've done enough. You've said enough. It's time to stop asking for crumbs from a table you built." I put the locket back on the nightstand, not because I was giving up, but because I was beginning to let go. Letting go isn't an explosion. It's the quiet setting down of things you've carried for too long. In the days that followed, I stopped asking. I stopped leaning into rooms where I wasn't welcomed, stopped leaving the hallway light on for conversations that would never come. It wasn't bitterness, it was something quieter, deeper, a stillness, the kind you feel after a storm has passed when the house is still standing, but you're no longer sure who it was built for. I began to move through the house like a guest, not on purpose. It just happened. My footsteps softened. I closed doors more gently. I started talking to myself in whispers out of habit. The kitchen, once my domain, now felt like neutral territory. I cooked less. I sat in corners. I used the old porcelain mug with the chipped rim because no one else wanted it, and because somehow I liked that we were both a little broken but still useful. And in that quiet, something else emerged. A voice I hadn't heard in years, my own. Not the voice I used to soothe a crying child, or to apologize for being in the way. No, a voice beneath all that, older, wiser, tired but steady. It told me the truth in gentle words. You are not being kept here. You are not loved here. You are being tolerated, and love does not tolerate, it embraces. The realization didn't come as fire. It came as fog lifting. I saw everything more clearly. Every skipped chair, every missed thank you, every careless comment and sigh. All of it formed a picture, a mosaic I had refused to step back far enough to see. I had become the wallpaper in their lives, always there, always familiar, easy to ignore. I stopped leaving folded laundry on their beds. I stopped replacing the toilet paper rolls. I stopped organizing the pantry by category and date. No one noticed, not for days. When they did, they grumbled, muttered about how things used to be more tidy when I cared more. But I did care. That was the point. I cared so deeply that I had erased myself in the process. There was a moment small but vivid that sealed it for me. I had made tea again just for myself, with the good leaves, the ones I used to save for when company came. I sat by the window with the chipped mug, the light warming my feet, the garden quiet and tangled below. I was holding the locket again, not wearing it, just turning it in my fingers like a memory I couldn't quite let go of. She walked past me, talking on the phone, laughing at something that had nothing to do with me. Didn't even glance my way, just kept walking. And I realized in that instant that I could vanish, and she wouldn't notice until the sink backed up or the refrigerator ran out of milk. I wasn't a person to her anymore. I was a utility. So I stopped waiting for the apology that would never come. I stopped trying to explain the ache in my chest to people who rolled their eyes at my pauses. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply went quiet in a new way, one that no longer hoped to be heard. I started planning. Not for confrontation, not for revenge, just for distance, for dignity. Because when silence becomes your only language, you learn to write your freedom in gestures they'll never notice until it's already too late. That evening, after the house had settled into its usual rhythm of television noise and scattered footsteps, I went to my room and opened the drawer, where I had kept the envelope, the one with the original wedding check. I stared at it for a long while, my thumb tracing the edge of the paper, brittle now with time. That money, that fund had been my quiet promise. A soft commitment tucked between casseroles and doctor appointments, between her teenage tantrums and the nights I stayed up sewing buttons for extra cash. I didn't just save that money for her wedding. I saved it for her happiness, for her security, for the day she might look at me and say, "Thank you for thinking of me even when I wasn't thinking of you." But that day never came. I pulled out the entire fund, what remained of it, some tucked-away cash, the check, and a small velvet pouch with the last gold ring I owned that hadn't been sold during one of the emergencies. I laid them all out on the bed, not to count, but to reckon, to remind myself this was love too. Not grand, not loud, but real. And then very quietly I took it all back. I didn't announce it. I didn't make a show of it. That's not my way. I simply gathered the items, slipped them into my handbag, and walked them to the bank the next morning. I told the teller I'd like to move everything to a private account, one with only my name. She nodded, typed, printed. I signed. That was all. No thunder, no applause. Just quiet reclamation. When I got back home, no one noticed I had left. The living room was just as I had left it. Crumbs on the coffee table, remote controls stacked haphazardly. Shoes kicked off in a trail leading to the hallway. They had gone out again. I sat down in the armchair I used to rock her in when she was colicky and restless. My body remembered the rhythm even now. Forward, back, forward, back. Only now I wasn't rocking a baby, I was steadying myself. Later that night, she came into the kitchen holding a dress catalog, flipping through it, without looking up. "Do you think the florist will still hold our deposit?" she asked. "I know you said we had the money set aside." I stirred my tea slowly, the sound of the spoon brushing porcelain louder than her words. I didn't answer right away. I wanted the silence to be felt this time. When I did speak, I looked directly at her. "I've taken the wedding fund back." She blinked, like she hadn't quite heard me. "What?" I said, "I've closed the account. The money is no longer available." The pause that followed was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Her mouth opened, then closed again, confused more than anything, not hurt, not understanding, just surprised. "You're joking, right?" I took a sip of my tea. "No." "But why?" Her voice cracked just a little, just enough to show that for once she might be seeing me as something with power. I looked at her, and I didn't speak with bitterness, just truth, because I finally realized you're not entitled to everything I spent my life giving. She stared at me, uncomprehending. I didn't fill the silence for her. I let it do what it had always done for me, carry the weight of everything unsaid. She stormed out, slammed the door to her room. It rattled but didn't break. I finished my tea slow and steady. I didn't need the money. That was never the point. I needed to remember it was mine to give and mine to take back. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt something soft and strong bloom quietly in my chest, relief. The morning after she slammed her door, the house was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that carries tension just beneath the floorboards, like a storm has passed, but left the air too heavy to breathe. I moved through the kitchen without making a sound. No one had come down for breakfast. No footsteps, no clatter of dishes, just me, the kettle, and the creak of my own bones. I sat at the table with my tea, no appetite, but the warmth helped. I'd grown used to these solitary mornings, but this one felt different, lighter. The decision had already been made, and my heart, so long clenched and cautious, was finally loosening. There was a strange calm in knowing I had acted not to punish, but to protect what little was left of me. She didn't come out until late. Her face was drawn, eyes avoiding mine. There was no apology, no questions, just muttered sounds about being late, about how everything was messed up now, and how she didn't know what to do. She didn't speak directly to me, just to the room, to the walls, as if I was no longer a participant in her script. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I had nothing left to offer in the language she understood. Pleasing, placating, shrinking. I was done shrinking. Later that day, she sent me a message. Not a conversation, just a message. A string of clipped words asking if I would reconsider, if I would at least fund the essentials. Essentials, she said, like love should come, with itemized receipts. I didn't answer. I didn't delete the message either. I left it there, unread but not unnoticed. I wasn't being cruel, I was being finished. That night she tried again, this time with more edge. Accused me of being vindictive. Said things like, "After all I've done for you," as if she had been the one staying up through fevers and scrubbing floors and saving coins in silence. I didn't respond to that either. Because when someone uses guilt as currency, they reveal how little they valued what was freely given. I made dinner that night for myself only. A small plate of sautéed greens and rice. No leftovers, no extras. I washed my own dish and put it away. When she came down, she opened the fridge and sighed dramatically. "There's nothing to eat." I said, "There's plenty to cook." She stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Maybe I was. Maybe kindness with boundaries is a dialect she never learned to hear. But still, I didn't argue. I didn't defend or explain or offer. I simply returned to my room, pulled the curtain back, and sat in my chair by the window as the night fell. It was then I thought about all the times I'd bent myself into shapes to accommodate her needs. How I'd told myself I was being a good mother, a good woman, by sacrificing everything. But somewhere along the way, I had confused love with submission and silence with grace. Now I was learning that silence can also be a boundary. She could stew in her indignation if she needed to. She could cry, yell, or sulk. That was her journey. Mine was to reclaim my space, one quiet gesture at a time. There's a power in not responding, in not defending your right to draw a line, in knowing your reasons without needing to write them out in apology. I closed the curtain and turned off the lamp. My room felt fuller somehow, even in the dark, not with sound, but with presence, my presence. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a background character in someone else's story. I felt like myself. The next morning, I woke up before the sun again, but this time I didn't drift into the kitchen or check the laundry. I didn't begin my day with chores or worry. I just stayed in bed for a little while under the soft weight of my quilt, listening to the birds begin their gentle calls through the window. I thought, this is what peace sounds like. Not silence, not absence, but presence without demand. A stillness that isn't empty, but full of intention. I slipped on my robe and walked outside barefoot into the garden. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and green things. My roses were blooming again. I had stopped tending them some time ago, distracted by the lives of others, their needs and lists. But here they were, soft, strong, unapologetically alive. I crouched down to clip a few dried leaves. My knees ached, but not in a complaining way. They simply reminded me that I'd carried a lot of weight in this life. As I moved among the plants, I felt something return to me, something I hadn't noticed was missing. It wasn't just time or peace. It was joy, quiet joy, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need to be performed for anyone. The kind that lives in noticing your hands in the soil, your breath steady, your heart not racing from disappointment. Inside the house was still asleep. but I was very much awake. That afternoon, I took a long walk to the library. I hadn't been in months, years maybe. The woman at the desk remembered me. "You used to come every week," she said. "We missed you." I smiled, not politely, but truthfully. I missed me too. I left with a stack of books, heavier than I needed, but I didn't mind carrying them. I passed by the bakery and bought a small apple tart, the kind she used to love when she was small. I brought it home and placed it on the table. She didn't touch it. That was fine. It wasn't for her anymore. It was a memory made manifest, one I would savor alone if I chose. Later, I turned on the old music I used to dance to in the kitchen. I let it play while I chopped vegetables for dinner, just enough for one. My hips still moved awkwardly, but with intention. My reflection in the oven door showed a woman with lines around her mouth, but softness in her eyes. A woman who had given everything and now finally was giving something back to herself. I didn't feel vengeful. I didn't even feel sad. I felt free. There's a moment when the grief exhausts itself and all that's left is clarity. I had reached it, and it wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, steady like a river that's always been there waiting for me to sit beside it. That night she asked, "Are you upset with me?" I looked at her, not with bitterness, but with truth. "No," I said. "I've simply stopped chasing after what doesn't see me." She frowned, but I didn't explain further. I didn't soften the edges. Sometimes clarity sounds like cruelty to those who've only known you as soft. She turned away confused. I let her. Because I had begun turning toward the things that nourished me, toward myself. I had been the soil, the rain, the sun, and now finally I was also becoming the bloom. That evening I sat by the fireplace, not because it was cold, but because the flicker of flame against old wood felt like company. I used to sit there when she was young with her head in my lap reading fairy tales and brushing her hair back with my fingers. I remembered how she used to say, "Don't stop reading, Mama. Just one more page." She would look up at me with those big eyes that believed I was the safest place in the world. How quietly that belief had faded. I reached for my stationery box, the one I kept tucked beneath old photo albums and unopened holiday cards. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. I chose the thickest paper, the kind I'd been saving for important words, and I began to write. It wasn't a letter meant to change anything. It wasn't even meant to be sent, but it needed to exist. I wrote slowly, deliberately. "I'm not angry. I'm tired. I'm tired of waiting for your kindness to come back to me like change from a bill I paid too long ago. I don't want an apology. I don't even want understanding. I just want distance from the way you've made me small. There was a time when your joy was my reason, when your pain felt like mine to carry. But now I see that you have grown into someone who only remembers me when something needs fixing, funding, or folding. And I've decided I'm not furniture. I'm not a light switch you flip when it's convenient. I don't know what happens next. But I do know this: I will no longer shape myself to fit inside your expectations. I will no longer hand you the tools to hollow me out." I folded the letter, sealed it, and tucked it into a drawer I rarely opened. Maybe she'd find it someday. Maybe not. But the words were no longer living in my chest, pressing against my ribs. That was enough. I spent the rest of the evening sifting through old photographs. I wasn't looking for nostalgia. I was looking for truth. I wanted to remember who I had been before I began dissolving into other people's needs. And I found her in black and white, smiling with paint on her cheeks, barefoot in the garden, laughing so hard her eyes crinkled shut. That woman still lived inside me. I could feel her stirring. She had once danced barefoot on wet grass. She had once spoken her mind without lowering her voice. She had once believed she mattered. I went to bed that night and left the bedroom door slightly open, not as an invitation, but as a gesture of peace. A reminder that love doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it just quietly steps back and says, "Not like this." In the middle of the night, I heard soft footsteps outside my door. A pause, a shadow, then retreat. No knock, no words. That was fine. Some things aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to be rewritten, redefined, or released. I rolled onto my side facing the window and watched the moon carve light across the floor. And I whispered something, not to her, but to myself. I'm still here. 1 year later, on the morning of my next birthday, I didn't wait for anyone. I woke up before the sun like always, but this time there was no ache in my chest, no lingering hope tucked behind my ribs. There was just me wrapped in a warm sweater, feet tucked into slippers, humming a tune I hadn't remembered in years. I made myself breakfast eggs toast, a touch of marmalade. I brewed the good tea, the loose-leaf jasmine I'd been saving for guests who never came. I used the best china, the delicate blue and white set I'd been afraid would chip if handled too often. Today I decided was worth the risk. There were no cards, no candles, no clumsy gifts or obligatory hugs, and still I was full, more full than I had ever been in years, because everything on that table had been chosen with care, for me, by me. I played my favorite record, scratched soft and warm like an old friend. I opened the curtains and let the morning pour in gold and gentle lighting up the dust in the air like confetti. And then I baked myself a cake. Nothing extravagant, a simple vanilla sponge just the way I liked it. I licked the batter from the spoon like a child, laughing a little at the streak of flour on my cheek in the mirror. The house smelled like sweetness and warmth. I danced slowly, clumsily barefoot in the kitchen while the timer ticked down. When the cake cooled, I frosted it imperfectly, but with love, and placed a single candle in the center. I didn't wish for anything when I blew it out. Not because I had given up on wishing, but because for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to be rescued from anything. I had rescued myself. There was no knocking on my door that day, no text from her, no voice asking if I wanted company. But I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. I sat on the porch with a slice of cake and a book in my lap. The breeze curled around me soft as a shawl. A neighbor waved, and I waved back. A sparrow landed on the railing close enough to feel like a kind of blessing. I had spent too many years building birthday parties in other people's names, baking cakes for mouths that forgot to say thank you, wrapping love in boxes, only to see it returned rewrapped and stripped of meaning. But now I had given myself something far greater, permission to stop asking to be loved in ways they were never taught to give. Permission to stop showing up for people who saw me only as a role, not a soul. In that quiet celebration, I felt everything I used to beg for finally arrive, not from them, but from me. Dignity, calm, joy that didn't need to be clapped for. I didn't take a picture of the moment. Some memories are too sacred for cameras. I just let it live in the marrow of my bones, where truth settles deepest. I sat there long after the sun began to set, the last light wrapping the porch in gold. And I whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the part of myself that had waited so patiently to be remembered. The part that had survived. The part that had stayed kind even through the forgetting. The part that at last had come home. There are endings that feel like storms, loud, sharp, unrelenting. But this ending, this one was different. It didn't crash or roar. It arrived like dusk, quiet and soft, folding itself gently around me. I used to think healing meant confrontation, that to reclaim your worth, you had to shout it into the faces of those who forgot it. But now I know better. Some wounds don't need noise to close. They need stillness, distance, a quiet, sacred returning to the self. I look around now and see the shape of my life, not in the expectations I once tried so hard to meet, but in the tiny, unnoticed moments I've finally claimed for myself. A warm drink held with both hands, a chair that fits my back just right, music that plays only for me. There is peace here, not because they changed, but because I did. Because I remembered that I am not the leftovers of someone else's neglect. I am not the weight someone else didn't want to carry. I am my own beginning. They may never understand what they lost when they treated me like an afterthought. And that's all right. I no longer live for their realizations. I live for the silence that wraps itself around me like velvet. I live for the stillness that doesn't ache. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. And in the quiet that followed, I gave them nothing,